I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is obviously a very special night in the history of the Taft School. It's a rather sad event that we are meeting here in a room which I just learned is blessed with one portrait, that of Mr. Joseph Choate, who resides over there. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but we'll have to ask Fred Janung to explain that later on. We're obviously gathered here tonight to honor a member of the Taft School faculty, and in so doing we honor all of the faculty of our school. Quite a number of people wanted to come down tonight. In fact, I think it's fair to say that the entire faculty would have come if the school's budget would have allowed them to. And so that there are those who would like to be here but are holding the fort, so to speak, up in Watertown. But I would like to introduce the faculty that have come down. It is possible that I might miss one or two, but I would like each to stand, and I would also ask that you reserve your applause for them until I have introduced all of them to you. The first would be the first woman graduate of a college who has graduated from the Taft School, and that is Ashley Lamb, who is this year's Carpenter Fellow. Just stand, Ashley, and you're going to have to remain standing. Please don't applaud. That's all right. I think it's fair enough. I would like to introduce John and Carol Noyes, both. John has been for many years a language teacher at Taft and is currently the holder of the Independence Foundation Chair. John. Dick Lovelace and his wife Peggy. Dick is, as you know, a former alumni secretary and a master teacher of English at the school. Jack Snow, who is head of the day students admissions and is the overseer of day students in general at the school, a teacher of French and Spanish. John and Kitty Bergen. John Bergen has been, in my time as headmaster, the dean of faculty and right arm, I'm sorry to say, for Taft, but very proud for John that he is going out next year to be the headmaster-elect of the Polytechnic School in Pasadena, California. Neil Curry, an outstanding biologist and naturalist known by the students as Foggy Neil. He is the first Taft graduate that I've introduced tonight. Ted Green, a coach, master scheduler, and outstanding teacher of mathematics. Al Reef, who is held virtually every post at Taft in the science area, who has been the director of college placement and is currently the dean of academic affairs. Fred Janung and his wife Dinny. Fred has, as you know, been the director of development and alumni secretary in recent years and is responsible for the extraordinary job we do in annual fundraising. Pecky Lodge, who has been the director of admissions for girls in the opening years and most recently Joe's assistant in the admissions office. Ferdy Wandelt and his wife Joanna. Ferdy will succeed Joe Cunningham as the director of admissions next year. And then in addition, Walter Frankel, I spotted out there, who's the Taft School librarian in charge of the extraordinary library we have at the school. And now two other women who work with us, Joan Atwood, who is Fred's assistant in the alumni office, and the most important person of all, Mary Butterly, who has been for nearly 20 years the person who has put up with Joe Cunningham as his secretary. It's now my privilege to introduce two of Taft's first ladies. I've been privileged tonight to have them on my right and left hand, Edith Cruikshank and Patsy Auden. Behind any great man, it's always said that there is a great lady. I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure that Paul would agree with this, that between the two of us we had two wonderful headmasters' wives, but that they, as key figures in our community, could not have performed all the duties that they have as well and as fully if it hadn't been for the next person. Behind every headmaster's wife, I think we could say, there is another woman. And in this case, the other woman is a great friend of students, a great friend of alumni, a great friend of faculty, and the person who really puts up with Joe Cunningham, Betty Cunningham. We're here to honor an admissions man, and lest we get overly sentimental, I want to tell you exactly what I think of admissions men. Not much. And that goes back to my own experience as a young person going off to boarding school a long time ago. I, for some reason, decided that I wanted to go to either Andover or Exeter, and so my father took me up to those two schools to be interviewed. And the first school that we went to was Exeter. It was a pretty severe era, I think, as I look back on it. But in any case, it was with a considerable amount of apprehension that I went in to be interviewed for the first time. And when we arrived there, Pike Rounds, who was then the admissions man at Exeter, informed me and my father that I not only had to be interviewed, but I had to be interviewed in front of my father. That is, he took us on both at the same time, which was pretty awkward for a 13-year-old who was afraid of making a mistake. My father was a reasonably confident man, so he didn't mind much going in with me, thinking that his son might make a fool of himself, but there was no way that he could be humiliated by this experience. We got into the office and we sat down, and there were no amenities or pleasantries at all. Pike Rounds looked me in the eye, and he was a very sort of steely, austere New Englander, and he said, Lance, do you read the newspaper? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, what newspaper do you read? And I said, I read the New York Herald Tribune. And he said, well, that's quite good. He said, what section of the paper do you read first? And I said, well, sir, I read the front section, the first section first. And he looked me right in the eye and he said, isn't that a bit precocious for a 13-year-old? And I said, well, sir, it may be, but I have no choice because my father takes the sports section first. My father didn't like Exeter at all. That impression of what admissions men were all about, however, stayed with me for years, I think, until I came to Taft. And then I found a different kind of admissions man, a person who didn't try to trap kids, who didn't try to find out exactly how they were going to perform academically by asking them to spell or by putting them in a situation where they felt ill at ease. I found somebody that cared quite greatly about each and every young person that he saw, and that threw me, and I guess between the impression and the language that Joe used, I can say that I've been thrown ever since. In any case, I think that the key to Joe Cunningham's career as an admission man at Taft is really rooted in the fact that he isn't an admissions person at all. He's been an imposter for many years. He is really a schoolmaster, not an admissions man, and he treats everybody in that light. Just quickly, I'd like to remind you of all the things he's done at Taft. If any of you have ever seen him walk down the hall, you know he bangs his ankles together when he walks. And if you don't believe me, when he leaves here tonight, look at his shoes. The heels are worn one against the other because he can't keep his feet out of each other's way. In spite of that, he was one of the greatest coaches of intramural sports the school has ever known. He really doesn't like to work. but he was once the head of the school's job program and is really the person who created that originally. He was, early in his career, the head of the middle corridor and head of the middle class committee of the faculty. He was at another time an outstanding language teacher, that is foreign language. He does something to the English language which we're not quite entirely sure of. But he was a great Spanish teacher and a great French teacher. And he was, of course, later dean of students, in spite of the fact that he's got a heart of gold and never really liked to discipline anyone. He was, beyond that, assistant headmaster, in spite of the fact that he was asked many times to be a headmaster. He chose to give his life in service to 3 headmasters of the school and to Taft as an institution. Perhaps the most commendable thing that I could say about Joe would be to refer back to the list of admissions directors in, say, 1965 or 66, a decade ago. Joe's name would be there. There would be lots of other fine people, including that man that interviewed me from Exeter. The fact of the matter is that virtually every one of those individuals gave up at some point in the 60s. In the face of the tremendous change of our society, in the face of coeducation and lots of different forces, they felt incapable of encountering and overcoming those changes and of responding to individual young people in spite of that. Joe remained steadfast in his belief in young people throughout those tumultuous times, and I think that that is a tremendous testimony to the fiber of the man and to his fundamental character, which is that of a great schoolmaster. What I really believe about Joe is that in an age where we read so much about institutions dominating each of us, and in fact every individual in our society, he has invariably fought that trend, that theme, and has placed individuals before the Taft School, before any organization in our society. In so doing, I think it's fair to say that he has transformed the spirit of Taft, the institution itself, and assured that it was a humane school and one which cared deeply about each and every young person that came to it. In a very real way, he has been the teacher of each and every one of us in this room. And it would be my estimation that the strength of our school, of the Taft School today, is very much due to the model that he set for all of us and from what he provided for us as a teacher of the faculty, of the students, of the alumni, and perhaps most of all, of Taft's headmasters. I think, having said all of that, it is fair then to turn to one of my predecessors, the man who has many, many wonderful accomplishments. He's hired a number of fine people. He made a great school in his time as headmaster. But I think when the history of Taft is written, say at the time of our 100th anniversary, it will be said that Paul Cruikshank's greatest accomplishment was that he hired Joe Cunningham.
Curious, I have this headmaster talking about one of the dearest friends I ever had, one of the fellows with the biggest, warmest heart, the nicest guy I ever knew, was the fellow Pike Rounds. You must have been difficult at 13, Lane.
I haven't changed.
I felt that I must not exceed the 4 minutes which Mr. Janong very generously allotted me. So I have written my thoughts down, so I will read them instead of recite them. I can't tell you how nice it is to be again at one of these annual New York gatherings. It is a great pleasure to be here and a privilege to take part in this very, very special occasion. This couple whom we are honoring tonight well deserve praise and appreciation from all who care about Taft and its well-being. These two people have surely gone far, far beyond the call of duty, as they have for these many years made respectively their very generous contributions to the school. I can remember very vividly, and this is honest, you all will someday learn this yourselves, discover it someday, that as one ages, one's memory about the more remote days is sharper than it is about the more recent days. I can honestly remember the day I engaged Joe to join our faculty. He was splendidly qualified in all respects, a graduate of Princeton. To quote Mr. Nixon's recent remark, that little Ivy League college which was greatly improved by Woodrow Wilson. Did you happen to notice that? He had his master's degree from Harvard, which is supposed to be a good thing. Had studied at 3 universities in France, and had been teaching at Northwood School up at Lake Placid for 3 years. He immediately demonstrated in his very first year that he was not only a superior teacher of foreign language, but far more, that he had all the attributes of a true and outstanding schoolmaster. Joe questions my veracity. Scott, that means truthfulness. Scott was just picking on me just for dinner, and I want to get back at him. Joe questions my veracity in regard to this boastful statement I'm about to make. I insist on making it, though, because, with all due respect, Joe himself is not infallible. Also, the symmetry of my historic decisions and actions appeals to my sense of the dramatic, or perhaps of the prophetic. Quite incidentally, purely in passing, my decisions and actions do make me look pretty good. The very first faculty teaching appointment I made my years at Taft was Joe Cunningham. The last appointment I made was a young fellow from Princeton. He came from that same Princeton, Lance Orden. As a matter of fact, really the first appointment I made at Taft, but not a faculty appointment, was Joe Lakowicz, and he too, like Joe Cunningham, made a most significant contribution to the school. It hurts to admit this, but I must confess that in between these inspired appointments, I slipped, shall I say, a time or two. The relationship between Joe and me throughout our many years of close association was always a direct, open, and friendly one, characterized, I think, confidently by mutual trust and confidence, a very satisfactory one from my point of view. Apparently, I've come to learn this in my retirement years, from Joe's point of view, there were times when this relationship was subjected to rather severe strains. Joe's versions of vividly remembered incidents differ a bit from mine. I comfort myself when I hear them by keeping in mind that Joe's stories were apt to border on the apocryphal. Also, Joe did have a flair for the dramatic and was rather fond of hyperbole. One Saturday mid-afternoon in Joe's first years, as Joe tells the story, he and I stepped out of the dining room lobby onto the rear porch facing the pond. We were shattered by the gruesome sight which met our eyes. About 100 middlers had violently attacked the seniors at the then senior house, later Jiggershop, and a frightening, awesome, and tumultuous battle was being enacted in front of us. One quick look told us that this was the most dangerous conflict which had to be stopped at once before serious injuries took place. According to Joe, I said, "Joe, you better get out there quickly and stop this." Before somebody gets killed. Then I turned on my heels and went off in the opposite direction. The incident, though, which probably came closest to destroying our relationship for good, took place when Joe returned to Taft after his 3 years' service in the Signal Corps, World War II. Just what he did in the Signal Corps, I'm not sure now. Since Joe always had trouble with his eyes, as a matter of fact, once he took off his glasses, he had to be led around by hand. It must have been something very special. However, like 10 or 12 other men left Taft to do their part in the war, he served his country loyally, unselfishly, and effectively for 3 years. Needless to say, he was warmly welcomed back to Taft and quickly resumed his important teaching responsibilities. No one was happier to see him back than the headmaster, and he let Joe know this in the strongest of expressions of gratefulness for his return. Some 15 or 20 years later, after this happening, but this time Joe had mellowed quite a bit, he told me that the first salary check which he received after his return was considerably less than those he'd been receiving before he went off to the war 3 years before. What tolerance he must have possessed. I don't think Joe indulged in any hyperbole that time. Those years, as a matter of fact, in the mid-40s, I vividly recall, were the most difficult financially for the school of all my years at Taft. I do not want to leave you with the impression that this man Cunningham was perfect and could do no wrong. I recall one act of his which caused me considerable anxiety and trouble. This happened at a time when we were having one of our finest years. That's a new phrase of mine, finest years. The faculty was a superior one in all respects. The student body was able, industrious, responsible, and cooperative. The staff was hard-working and efficient. We finally had achieved the impossible. Every important responsibility in the school was in the hands of a capable, effective, and reliable person. The morale was strong. We truly had a smoothly functioning operation. At Taft, the headmaster is, I'll admit, of some importance, but truly, the most important person in the school has always been the superintendent of buildings and grounds. Truly, without our Mr. Hannings, we would soon fall apart. Next in importance, if not equal importance, is the dietitian. Without an able person in that role, the morale of the school quickly vanishes. Suddenly, one day, my complacency about our smooth operation was shattered. The dietitian announced she was going to leave. Without any consultation with me, without any permission or approval from me, right out of the blue, Mr. Cunningham had decided to marry her. I was very big about it, as usual, and quickly forgave him. And through these years, what a wonderful team they've been, and how much they have given to Taft. Betty proved to be always a comfort, a help, and a joy to Miss Crookshank. And Joe was always all of that, and more too, to me. These two people have served Taft School these many years, devotedly, unselfishly, loyally, and most effectively. They have our respect, our admiration, and our affection. They surely deserve from us all our sincere thanks and our deep gratitude.
I always arrange to have Paul speak first because I like to make a number of observations about what he has to say. One would be, some of you have heard this theme before, that there's no question of his financial acumen or wisdom as headmaster of Taft. He hired Joe Cunningham in 1937 for a very small sum of money. That was his first appointment. He hired me in 1961 for the same sum of money. If it weren't for the fact that he hired me, I would have said he peaked early. The next man whom we're going to call on to speak was an outstanding athlete at the school. He was a great monitor. He was later a great success in life. But the truth of the matter is that I think he is the person that helped Joe through his early years as a corridor master at the school, and in those days when he bailed Joe out time after time on the middle corridor, the two of them forged a relationship which has remained strong and enduring ever since. From the class of 1939, Spanky Sheldon.
I have my notes too, and I hope I do a better job in the 4 minutes than Paul did. I really think that this is so much fun tonight that Joe ought to come back and retire next year. I was deeply flattered when Lance called and asked if I would be here tonight. And Sylvia and I get the award for coming the greatest distance because we live in New Zealand now. But I just happened to be in Illinois the day that he called, and matter of fact, it was the day that we got back in this country. And of course, I'd come for this reason. I had suspected at the time that, as he referred to the middle floor, et cetera, that he was going to want me to mention a particular fracas that transpired, but I promise Edith I won't mention it. But I did bring my report card. This is my report card. My mother saved everything. And I'm going to read to you that which Joe had to say to my parents January 28th, 1938. Because I thought that only to be fair, before I said some nice things about him, I ought to see what he said about me. Baird's work has continued at about the same pace. There's more. But his exam before the holidays was definitely poor. Also, he had days when his preparation, he never could write. His preparation has been wobbly. However, he continues to be interested and attentive in the classroom, thank God for that, and should complete the course successfully. Now you can appreciate that after reading this, it was pretty tough to be objective tonight. Through the years, I'd forgotten how really honest and candid he could be. But tonight I want to touch on an incident I've never mentioned to anyone before, and he's probably long since forgotten about. And it also brings into the evening the fact that we've got Joe here and tell him how we love him and how we respect him. But there are two other men. Those of you who were at school in those early years will remember Jim Logan, who's no longer with us, and Bill Sullivan. Neither one of them needed Joe Cunningham to become the great people in our hearts that they became. But Bill Sullivan, I talked about this with Paul Cruikshank tonight, and he forgets this incident, and I think one reason is that In 1936, when Bill Sullivan came to Taft, Paul Cruikshank came to Taft, and I think he had a few things on his own mind. But Bill came, and how many of you here were at Taft in 1936? Well, you remember how we had a hard time remembering that he was a member of the faculty and not a member of the junior class. And we teased him unmercifully. We were cruel to him, really. I don't know how he ever got through that first year. And then in 1937, Joe Cunningham came to school. And that fall, I don't remember where it was, but we either whistled as Bill Sullivan went by or we said, swish. And Joe Cunningham was standing next to me, and he turned to me and he said, "Why do you guys have to be so cruel?" And we thought about it. And by the time that year was over, no one teased Bill Sullivan. And we all know he came to be a fabulous teacher. Joe not only helped students, he helped everybody. Everyone would go into his office and get their battery charged. He was just like a trickle charger. My son, who was in the class of 71, he doesn't think I have any more right to Joe Cunningham as a friend than he does. And we're 30 years apart. And I called him and asked him if he had any ideas of what he'd want to say tonight, and he's on the telephone. I was paying for it, and he was thinking. Finally, in the modern vernacular, he said, "Well, Dad, all I can say is that Joe Cunningham's like a Mars bar. He's indescribable." Getting under my 4 minutes, I could go for ages. All of you could. I'm sure every one of you wished you could be up here tonight. Relatively speaking, few of us go through life following a career or a way of life we're confident is the one we would choose or for which we were destined. As we grow older and wiser, we realize this is not all bad. Often the surprises are what make life exciting. I cannot believe that Joe Cunningham started out in his career or at Taft with the idea of carving out this particular niche into which he is so magnificently fallen. And I doubt whether he will ever be able to accept the magnitude of his success. Great men have integrity, and great men have humility. And that sure is Joe Cunningham.
Some of you have been parents of Taft students or students who have gone off to other boarding schools. You remember the awkwardness of that initial admissions experience. You remember what it was like to go to foreign places time after time with your children. The next speaker is a person who has an unusual amount of experience with the Taft School. He is not a graduate. He is not one who taught at the school. But he is someone who had 3 sons at the school, who spent countless afternoons freezing in May's rink, who set a record, I think, for Father's Days in being there 12 consecutive times. If you can imagine having to hear headmasters talk 12 consecutive times, you understand what a great accomplishment this is. But more important than that, he is someone who had to face Joe on 3 different occasions with young men who each in their own right turned out to be outstanding people. And it is now a great pleasure for me to introduce Charlie Wardell.
Although Joe and I had probably bumped into each other at Princeton, he was a mainstay of the Cliosophic Society, which is, you uneducated people may not know as the nation's oldest political debating society. It was in the late fall of 1958 that our son Chuck, an admissions applicant, and I had the privilege of meeting Joe Cunningham. On the way to Taft, we were stopped at a traffic light in Waterbury after a real cloudburst and a torrent was pouring down a side street. On one side of this street was a convent, and on the other an empty lot in which a circus was set up. As we watched, two sisters came out of the convent and stopped at the curb, wondering how to get across. At the same time, two clowns came out of the circus tent, sized up the situation, waded through the water to the other side, and each took a sister piggyback and started back across the street. In the middle, one clown turned to the other and said, "This is verging on a ridiculous." Chuck and I contemplated each other, understanding the clown's sentiments. We had been to prep schools in Massachusetts and Connecticut and as far afield as Pennsylvania with very little luck. In each case, the admissions officer inspected Chuck's data, he had not tested well, and proceeded to interview me. I always interviewed badly, so needless to say, Chuck was not meeting with much success. We had a pleasant but businesslike welcome from Joe Cunningham, who did the unexpected and interviewed Chuck, not me. He then indicated that if Chuck didn't screw up before the next fall, Taft would take him, and Chuck did go to Taft. His bumpy academic career eventually confirmed Joe's faith when he graduated cum laude from Harvard. The initials J.C. took on a new meaning in the Wardell household, and our other sons, Chris and David, followed Chuck on through Taft. As an observer of Joe Cunningham and the Taft scene for 13 years, during the reigns of three headmasters, I can testify to one constant: the admissions office, its workings and success. Applicants have grown in numbers and qualifications, as you know, and an important reason has always been the way Joe managed this office. His warm yet objective meetings with these boys visiting Taft put them at their ease and at their best. He complimented them by discussing matters alone with them and won many an applicant who was headed elsewhere. And in those cases where Joe's experience and wisdom led him to take a calculated risk with a youngster such as Chuck, his judgment was usually confirmed and the school benefited. But quite aside from Taft's gain, Joe has made an extraordinary contribution to many individual people. With perspective on conventional wisdom, Joe has considered candidates for admission not only on the basis of their grades and aptitudes, but with a kind of intuitive appraisal of future capabilities, ensuring many boys a chance at more constructive and satisfying lives, which is what Taft is all about. These are boys who might otherwise have been considered odd boys out and out for the rest of their lives. What greater good can one human being do in his life? Joe has been the best admissions man in the business, in our experience, while simultaneously discharging these other duties which you've heard about. I only tonight learned that he'd been a coach, but I knew that he had been an assistant headmaster, head of the department, and carried a teaching load, all of which obviously he has done extraordinarily well. Another important function, completely unofficial and unsought, that Joe has shouldered over the years at Taft has been a kind of dean of parents and alumni. It has been routine for fearful, mystified, or just concerned parents, particularly alumni parents, to call Joe on a telephone to get a rundown on what has happened to little Johnny, to find out the score and to obtain Joe's recommendation about how to deal with the problem. Johnny quite probably had no idea how Mr. Cunningham had kept in touch with his work at Taft and knew all about him. Finally, in the handling of these many responsibilities, it has been Joe's positive spirit, and I'm sure his philosophy of life, which has refreshed and inspired us and will influence those who follow him at Taft. We are hopefully coming to an end of an era during which the interest, the drive, the force, the intelligence, particularly that of the journalistic and the academic communities, have emphasized the negative and the destructive and the pessimistic and the deficiencies of our society. This has reached a point where a reader of the New York Times fears for his country's very survival. Joe, to me, is the personification of that traditional American confidence, energy, and optimism, which assumes that problems are solvable and that the future can and will be an improvement on the present. And if that is so, it is because there are Joe Cunninghams among us. Joe, long life and happiness, and don't go too far away.
You can tell that Charlie has been gone from Taft for a number of years, and that he has attributed to Joe only the ability to advise and counsel boys. It was only a few years ago that Ed Douglas retired, and I said it was a good thing because he had a keen eye for women. I'm not sure whether it's characteristic of the age or whether it is simply the fact that Taft faculty have a keen eye for women, but it's fair to say that Joe, as Ed in another era too, came to enjoy and like the female members of our community every bit as much, and perhaps even more, than the boys. As a young faculty member, I often wondered about how Mary Butterly, Joe's secretary, put up with him. Joe's a very gracious guy, but every once in a while some Anglo-Saxon phrases come out that are very unlike what he normally says. And Mary is a very earnest and straight woman, very hardworking. She never blushed, she never said anything, and she simply smiled at Joe and went about her business. I should have known then that Joe had a special touch with every kind of female, that somehow he communicated his concern for them, and thus I shouldn't have been surprised with the fact that a few years after we had girls at Taft, his office would literally be inundated with them. If you go by his particular desk, where the door, and in his office the door is always open, very frequently now you will see 3 or 4 girls in there talking with Joe alone. Most often you will find one girl there, frequently with Joe sitting on the side of the desk where the applicants normally sit, and with this young lady sitting in Joe's chair. I don't know what that's indicative of, but I'm glad he's retiring. In any case, Joe obviously has a magnificent ability to appeal to all young people, and that has carried over to women at Taft in the last 5 years as well. To speak for the way that students at Taft see Joe in his last years as a schoolmaster, I'm going to call upon a member of this year's upper middle class, an outstanding athlete, a fine scholar, and a member of the class committee, Lee Tilney.
I guess I'm here to represent the younger generation here. When I came, well, the way I came to be here, I thought I'd been very subtle dropping hints to Mr. Wandel and to Mr. Auden that I'd like to get here. However, the only way I found out I could get here was if I spoke here. What comes to mind with Mr. Cunningham first with me is his sense of humor, because he puts up with all of us. But the second thing that comes to mind is the way he mumbles. He's always talking about something, and you never really know exactly what it is. In fact, you walk into his office, and I usually have a problem with French poetry, as Mr. Snow, my French teacher, knows. And I always go into Mr. Cunningham to help me, and I'm just about to ask him a question, and he starts telling me a story from the 1930s. Mr. Cunningham also brings to mind his kindness. But we won't dwell on that because everybody's going to talk about nice things about Mr. Cunningham. So I'll talk about his open-mindedness, because this is the way he relates to all the kids at Taft. He's always easygoing. He never gets shocked, and perhaps that's why he's lasted so long. In fact, I'm the one that's usually shocked, because for my birthday in February, he gave me a book called Sex and a Single Dog. And in the book, there are all these pictures of poodles hanging out of windows with their tongues hanging out, and they're saying, "Oh, Myrtle, isn't he a man?" Mr. Dunung gave me 5 minutes tonight, so I thought I'd talk about how Mr. Cunningham is really part of Taft. When I looked at boarding schools, I looked at Andover and Exeter and all the big boarding schools with the great facilities and a lot of money. But the reason I picked Taft was not because of facilities or because of all the courses offered. It was because of the people there and the personality and all the ideas I saw floating around. When I walked into Taft, people said hello to me and offered to help me instead of just sort of staring at me like I was a guinea pig. And there's a lot of pizzazz there, and the warmth really hits you. Well, Mr. Cunningham is the first person you see when you walk in there. He didn't happen to be the first one I saw, but that doesn't really make any difference, because he wrote me a lot of letters, and I usually lost them, so I'd write him letters back and ask him if he'd send me letters in pink envelopes so I wouldn't lose them the next time. He never obliged me, but I never lost another one. I thought I'd tell one of Mr. Cunningham's favorite stories. It's about when he taught French, and thank heavens French teachers never have experiences like this. But one day, Mr. Cunningham was teaching his AP French class, and he must have been teaching some very complicated concepts, because he said he hadn't the vaguest idea what he was talking about. Anyway, one of his students must have figured this out, because he walked over to the closet and he opened the door, and he said, "Oh my goodness, sir! Sir, come and look!" Well, Mr. Cunningham, being the gullible man that he is, walked over and looked, and someone pushed him from behind, and the next thing he knew, he was sitting on his derriere in the closet, with the door locked behind him. Well, most teachers would probably sit in the closet and pound on the door, scream, or turn their students in afterwards. But Mr. Cunningham decided he'd sit down and listen to see what would happen. Well, he obviously had an unusual class, too, because instead of the class running out of the room giggling, they all sat down and decided to conduct the class themselves. And as Mr. Cunningham says, it was the luckiest day of his life, because they all knew what they were talking about, and he had no idea. Anyway, I see Mr. Cunningham from a different perspective, because as Mr. Auden says, I'm always in his office bugging him. And he's great to me because we have this little system where we write each other's letters. And my pen name is Irving Bloomblatt. And every day I walk in there, and the next thing I know, I'm engaged in conversation about why we should put freshwater jellyfish in the pond to combat the catfish. Well, since there aren't any catfish and there are no freshwater jellyfish around, I can't understand what we're talking about. But it always puts me in a good mood. Anyway, the reason I did want to come here was to thank Mr. Cunningham for everything. I've had a lot more luck with the comments he's written me, as he is my advisor, because, as my mother said this winter, you sure have the wool pulled over his eyes, Lee. He always saves me just when I need him. Anyway, I hope he's had as much fun with all of us as we have had with him. Thank you.
Someone said to me earlier that the greatest testimony to Joe Cunningham was that he was not only a person who was well respected by all of us, but someone who was well liked by us as well. The individual said that it was easy to be liked, or it was easy to be respected, but it was very difficult to be both, and that Joe was perhaps the only person that he knew that met that standard, and I fully agree. It is, I think, in the spirit of that comment, that it is particularly appropriate for me now to introduce the Taft School Chairman of the Board of Trustees, the grandnephew of the school's founder, a man for whom he is named, but most importantly tonight, a man who is a great teacher and a great humanitarian in his own right, and is as such, one of the very few colleagues that Joe Cunningham has. The man who will introduce him to you tonight, the Dean of Yale College, Mr. Horace Taft.